legacy of David Bowie in terms of all the other pop artists that have come after him.
David Bowie is someone whose music and whose approach and whose way of handling his own career, you hear it almost everywhere.
He's constantly seeing what's happening, taking it into himself and doing something different with it. And I think that makes him an artist that will always want to see what he's going to do next. He can't...
Why are you doing this for Brixton?
Because I can.
Yeah.
And somebody should, and so I'm doing it.
Okay. You met the people of Brixton here. What do you say to them?
Thank you for giving me a home.
Bowie spent his teenage years at Bromley Technical High School. It was here that he was punched in the eye in a fight over a girl. The eye never fully recovered, leaving it permanently dilated.
I don't know how his eye injury affected him, but I do know that it meant he had two different coloured eyes, which added to the strangeness and the fascination we've all had with David Bowie. I remember girls saying, well, yeah, he's got two different coloured eyes. You know, it's this kind of quite amazing thing. It's part of the otherworldliness. It's part of the sense that this person was absolutely unique. The artifice of being unique was only came from the reality of being unique.
The bell strikes another night.
The young David Jones was drawn to the lights of London's West End, where he often visited jazz clubs. On his 12th birthday, his mother bought him a plastic saxophone due to his passion for the scene. But an introduction to his father's record collection was to change everything. A collection of American 45s, including Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, and most significantly, Little Richard.
I think, like a lot of boys David Jones's age, he was struck by people like Little Richard and that kind of really wild, outrageous style. I mean, that's definitely something that's gone through all of Bowie's music, is that kind of sense of theatre and drama and being in your face.
Bowie's from the rock and roll generation. He was very, very young when rock and roll was the big deal, but it imprinted on him. And it's interesting that you would see later on lots of his more kind of cosmic, space-related, alien, polysexual creations would fundamentally be rooted in rock and roll as well. You know, they would be a cosmic Little Richard, or a space Chuck Berry.
I bought a brand new Airmobile.
Bowie had been caught up in the wave of American rock and roll stars that was moving British youth. He upgraded his plastic saxophone to the real thing and formed his first band, the Conrads.
Darling, my darling, I can't live without you.
Little known fact about David Bowie is that before he was David Bowie, the solo artist, he was actually in a lot of bands. One of them was the Conrads, and they sort of released very derivative 60s jangle pop, you know, akin to the Beatles' early stuff. So you would never have listened to that stuff and predicted what David Bowie, the solo artist, was going to do.
The Conrads were billed as the fabulous Conrads. Now, of course, they weren't very fabulous at all. They were a kind of very plodding sort of coffee shop band, and the coffee shop tradition was the one that the young David Bowie was most influenced by.
For me, the Conrads sounded pretty bluesy, which obviously did come from influence of Little Richard, but I feel like it wasn't as exciting as Little Richard. I mean, Chuck Berry, these performers were electrifying. The Conrads sounds quite safe and quite pedestrian.
I've heard bits and pieces of the really early David Bowie. You hear this period when he was just copying other people and he was just finding his feet, which I think everyone does. But then you had this change, and actually it was a lot of material which didn't get anywhere, but you listen to it now, it's totally Bowie, and it's very odd.
The Conrads achieved little success, and although Bowie continued to pursue music through a succession of bands, he found a talent as a student of the mime artist Lindsay Kemp.
I mean, there's no question that he was influenced quite strongly by Lindsay Kemp. You know, they'd worked together. Bowie was, to an extent, you know, a pupil and an admirer. So that's a huge part of what he was doing throughout his career. You know, Bowie was not just a singer and a performer. He was also a visual artist and a dance artist and a presenter of his ideas in his person, not just in what he sang and what he played.
Lindsay Kemp was a huge influence on Kate Bush. He appeared in a film called The Wicker Man. I mean, it popped up all over the place. But Lindsay Kemp was very key in teaching Bowie about mime, and also about this idea that you take what's on the inside and you put it on the outside, you externalise it. And I think you could see Bowie doing that all the time. The early Bowie footage, it was always performance, but it wasn't empty performance. You know, it always came from something within.
Things like the hype with the Beckenham Arts Lab, hugely important thing culturally for Bowie, and in terms of the influences that he's absorbing from, you know, Japanese no theatre or TV shows like Anthony Newley's Gurney Slade show or Lindsay Kemp's mime stuff. It's all just going vroom, vroom like that inside Bowie's head, and it's extraordinary. I mean, to have seen all that, to have been part of that, must have been an amazing experience.
He definitely saw pop as a vehicle for avant-garde ideas, that it could be enriched and made more exciting by bringing in the creativity of people who weren't working in pop music. But he never lost sight of the fact that pop had to be thrilling in its own right. It had to be outrageous. The songs had to be short, fast, punchy, fizzing with ideas. They had to be the kind of thing that was almost a slogan.
It was around this time David Jones began performing under the name of David Bowie, after the Alamo hero Jim Bowie and his famous Bowie knife. In the formative years of his career, New York band The Velvet Underground were a huge influence, with Bowie covering their single I'm Waiting for the Man.
David Bowie's always had a special relationship with Waiting for the Man. He was doing it on his very last concert tours. It's been a live staple on and off through his whole career. No one else was covering the Velvet Underground at that time. No one else had their eye on the ball sufficiently to understand that Lou Reed was a great songwriter. What on earth he was doing covering it so early, I don't really know.
I think the Velvet Underground influence was interesting because as an act they had this ability to transport you to another world, and I think that's exactly what David Bowie is trying to do with his music. It was a really kind of important period in music. A lot of things were happening at that point. People were trying different things out, and both of these artists could take you to places that you hadn't even imagined. David Bowie could take you to Mars.
I was amazed that he knew about the Velvet Underground at that time. I grew up and everyone knew about the Velvet Underground. But it sold, when that album came out, it sold in the hundreds. It didn't even sell in the thousands. So this is New York. It was quite incredible.
I think that just learning about the Velvet Underground and kind of being exposed to that really opened his eyes to this sort of arty downtown New York scene, and that probably helped expand his horizons both musically and in terms of sartorial and whatever.
It's a start of him being at the cutting edge, and it's almost the start of David Bowie, the man who's going to sell a lot of records.
A song that soundtracked the BBC coverage of the moon landing of...
A lot of acts now, they're releasing stuff and we're judging them on a couple of demos that are put up online.
A driven and talented person who was just not going to let the world not hear his talents.
Space Oddity on an acoustic guitar and no backup, which was, I think, even before it had come out as a single, so that was quite a thrill.
As the 1960s came to an end, Bowie made drastic changes to his image and formed a short-lived group known as The Hype. Performing in venues such as London's Roundhouse in outrageous outfits, it's now regarded by many as the start of glam rock.
I think the performance of The Hype is a huge touchstone in the birth of glam rock. You know, they're all dressed as superheroes, but it's critical that it's Bowie, Ronson and Visconti who are so central to what Bowie is doing at that point.
It was here that Bowie played with Mick Ronson, the guitarist that would stay with him throughout his glam era.
Everybody remembers the kind of homoeroticism of him and Mick Ronson, and the crocheted leotards and the crazy androgynous hairdos and so forth. But we tend to forget how astonishing it was that this was allowed on television at all. That this was just as outrageous in its way as punk rock was subsequently.
Although he would deny having been there, Mark Bolan, a teen friend to Bowie, was photographed at the show. Having once shared a manager and a producer in Tony Visconti, the friends ended a few years of musical rivalry.
The links between Bowie and Mark Bolan were very strong. In terms of competition, they were very, very different. Bolan was a much more sexy artist than David Bowie. Mark Bolan was much more prepared to appeal to the younger market. David Bowie was much more arty and much more, shall we say, artificial too.
Mark Bolan was just a great pop star at that time when music was starting to become a bit serious and a bit the preserve of quite boring people, and he just made it be about teenagers and screaming, and Bowie certainly took that part of thing on.
Allegedly, there was a competition between David Bowie and Mark Bolan. I think a little bit of healthy competition between musicians always helps get the fire in their belly going and makes them produce greater work.
In a sense, any kind of competition between them was sort of illusionary. And I say sort of because clearly they were the people that they were fighting against. They weren't fighting against the disco people. They weren't fighting against the Osmonds. They were scrabbling against each other for some kind of glam credibility. But they were probably more worried about Sweet and Slade at the time than each other, because they were kindred spirits too.
David Bowie and Mark Bolan were probably, between them, the two people most responsible for the sea change in British rock and roll. They both brought a sense of androgyny to their personae. They both started wearing things that, you know, leather-clad rock and rollers wouldn't normally wear, like dresses, like feather boas.
I think Mark Bolan started glam rock. Glam rock was all about vanity. It was all about being over the top and outrageous and, you know, wearing women's clothes and, you know, huge stack heels. And Bowie refined it, really. He turned it into high art, you know, with the Yamamoto outfits and the production of the whole thing.
In 1977, when Mark was tragically killed in a car crash, the connection between the pair remained very much alive. After it transpired Bolan had not updated his will to provide for his son Roland, Bowie paid for Roland's tutoring fees and made some other undisclosed financial contributions to the family. Bowie also had his own family at this time. Having met Angela Barnett in 1969, they married a year later and had their first child, Duncan Zoe. But Angela was as much a part of Bowie's professional life as his personal.
Well, there's two sides to the Angie Bowie story. If you listen to her, she was absolutely pivotal in David Bowie's career, and he would never have made it out of Bromley or Brixton without her. And she was not only his muse, the man whom he allegedly wrote Prettiest Star and Golden Years for, but she was his artistic inspiration. If you listen to anyone else, then she was the woman, or a bird as I believe they called them at the time, who would follow him around on tour and kind of get in the way a bit.
Angie!
Darling, I came to say good luck.
Oh, you look beautiful, darling. I love that.
David Bowie's first wife, Angie Bowie, was pretty instrumental, I think, in terms of opening David up to what was going on in America and, you know, allowing him to have this sort of open relationship with her and just, you know, kind of almost encouraging that flamboyant side of him to come out.
Angie Bowie, without doubt, encouraged this aura of bisexuality. They dressed like each other, and she basically encouraged him to promote
really important figure, because it's the first time that a star musician has recreated themselves into a completely different character. This wasn't just David Bowie with a different haircut and some different clothes. This was he'd become a different person with a different story, which he'd fictionalized. You know, he'd written a biography, he'd written a backstory, and he'd entered into a role. It was almost like a theatrical performance.
Before Ziggy, there was nothing. No serious pop star, no pop star of any description, had created an alter ego who was a cipher and a channel, and who was clearly not David Bowie. So to have the imagination and the artistic vision to do that is extraordinary.
I find that I'm a person who can take on the guises of different people that I meet. I can switch accents in seconds of meeting somebody, and I can adopt their accent. I've always found that I collect. I'm a collector. And I've always just seemed to collect personalities, ideas. I have a hodgepodge philosophy, which really is very minimal.
He's seen as a chameleonic figure, a sort of shape-shifting, ahead of the game, multiple personalities all combined into one, very colourful, character, and he particularly appeals, I think, in my experience, to men, men who were around at the same time as him, who were contemporaries, and also younger men who. It's almost like a romantic fascination with this guy who played with perceptions of himself.
For me, the seminal album's got to be Ziggy Stardust, for the image, for the music, for the influence that it has, for the aesthetic, everything. It just seems like a completely perfect album, and it's gone on to influence so many people. I think if you just listen to one David Bowie record, it's got everything you need.
There's a fantastic film, one of the great rock documentaries, which is called Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, made by D.A. Pennebaker, who's a legendary filmmaker. And that captures what was going on then. It captured the sort of chaos of the hysteria around Bowie, which is really just rising at that time of Ziggy Stardust.
You're not alone. You're watching yourself, but you're so unfair.
Ziggy stands above them all as being executed with such panache, and that still exerts a resonance 40 years later, you know, that here we are talking about it. If he had retired when Ziggy retired, we would still be talking about it.
Give me your hand. You're so wonderful.
The problem when you want to list the musicians and the artists who've been influenced by David Bowie is not where do you start, but where do you stop? I mean, look, let's start with the New York Dolls. Let's go on to, let's end with Lady Gaga. Let's look at all points in between.
I think you can't underestimate how much of an impact the character of Ziggy Stardust has had on popular culture. You know, he is the concept pop star, you know. Lady Gaga, Madonna, there are all these people now who are huge, who their stuff is referencing Ziggy Stardust, and he's just an incredible pop chameleon.
Sits like a man, but he smiles like a reptile.
Many, if not most, of the current crop of musicians, or musicians in the last 2 or 3 decades, have listened to Bowie, and they have had some influence in the way they've, if not in the way they present themselves, but in at least in the way that they investigate and explore music, and then produce it. No question about it. He's fantastically influential.
But Jean, let yourself go.
It was around this time Bowie opened his heart with a rare autobiographical note on the album Aladdin Sane.
Aladdin Sane is a fantastic album. Bowie has quite often written about his schizophrenic brother. And I believe Aladdin Sane, the name, was a play on his brother's insanity, or if you call it insanity, it was schizophrenia, which is a very, very harsh condition to live with. And it was hanging over him, you know, it was in the family. So I think this was, to an extent, it was informing everything. It was the tragedy which was reminding him of the past and the reality of his situation.
Not only did David Bowie's audience struggle to make the distinction between David Bowie and Ziggy Stardust, but in time, helped by industrial levels of cocaine, David Bowie failed to make the distinction between David Bowie and Ziggy Stardust. His alter ego bit back and consumed him. And I think, without being overly dramatic, almost killed him.
Having suddenly announced the shock death of Ziggy Stardust, Bowie took a dramatic new turn for the album Young Americans, absorbing the sounds of Philadelphia soul.
If nothing else, David Bowie is a fantastically intelligent artist. And when he took the decision to kill Ziggy Stardust, he was not so much at a crossroads, but he didn't know where to go or what to do. And it took him a couple of albums to get over Ziggy Stardust. Now, he was incredibly creatively restless. And his move towards funk and his embracing of black American dance culture was the first real sign of this. He made a really funky, a really sexy, a great album. And this was also the first understanding that David Bowie was in it for the long haul, that he was different, that he was ahead of...
Gets into something and then just becomes obsessed with it, and that was his plastic soul phase, as he would call it.
Beckenham and Ziggy and all that Ziggy represents. And that's a very Bowie thing to do. I've done this, it's run its course. What'll I do now? Something completely different. I guess it keeps you on your toes.
To actually change into a kind of young soul rebel was the hardest switch for a lot of his fans to accommodate, including me, I have to say. He thought, well, here's a guy who's been creating extraordinary music. Why is he going backwards? It made him more successful in America than it did here. The British public didn't like it very much, the Americans loved it. It wasn't so much a sea change as a soul change.
The glam era was over, and he was embracing American culture. I think, actually, I think it's all right to say this, I think he was embracing a lot of cocaine as well at the time.
Oh, Lord, I want the young American.
Whilst in America, Bowie not only found a new sound, he also found himself overrun by his addiction to drugs.
There's an underlying unease here, definitely. You can feel it in every avenue. It's very calm, and it's a kind of a superficial calmness that they've developed to underplay the fact that that there's a lot of high pressure here.
Feeling the pressure, Bowie and his friend Iggy.
However, the music that comes out of it is astonishing. I mean, this is where you get Heroes, which is considered by many to be his best record.
In the mid-70s, West Berlin was, of course, like no city on earth. It was this vibrant, decadent hotspot in the centre of East Germany. And it had this kind of desperation and vibrancy that no one else had. And if anyone in the mid-70s was in the mood for a little bit of dangerous, hedonistic decadence, it was David Bowie.
Though nothing will keep us together.
He was influenced by Neu and krautrock, and he just took that kind of side of things and made it his and dabbled with it. I think he was also going through a difficult time in terms of drug addiction, and I think that pain and that darkness and that dabbling in the seedier side of life definitely comes across in those records, which is interesting.
He draws on the iconography of the divided Berlin. He draws on the idea that there's a fissure down the middle of Europe, that there's a schism in the European heart, in the European soul almost, and he turns it into this, fantastically bleak, fantastically charismatic and bizarrely appealing.
Follow and do this.
Bowie became a worldwide superstar with Despite the tremendous success of the early 80s, Bowie felt trapped. He remarked, "I wonder how many Velvet Underground albums these people have in their record collections." He suddenly felt very apart from his audience.
There are people who would say that David Bowie in the 80s, starting with Let's Dance, is creatively his least successful period, certainly in comparison to Ziggy. But, what do we know? Let's Dance sold 8 million albums. I mean, it's his most commercially successful period.
Towards the end of the 80s and the early 90s, when Bowie started to go a little bit more electronic, he definitely divided his fans. I personally loved the soundtrack he did for Labyrinth. I thought it was hilarious.
What kind of magic spell to use?
Who doesn't want to see David Bowie dancing about in some tights with a mullet?
Jump, magic, jump.
Bowie's acting career was always an eclectic collection, from family fare such as Labyrinth and Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, to Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth.
The Man Who Fell to Earth, I was completely obsessed by. I saw it when I was about 11, and it really, really disturbed me. The images were sort of burnt onto my retina. There was one where there was a bank of TV screens, and I think he was sort of slowly dying. Nothing was explained. It was all very surreal. And Bowie was perfect for it. I don't think he even said much. He said about 3 words in the entire film, but it didn't matter. It's absolutely captivating, but disturbing too.
Bowie's acting is, it's a massively varied thing, and you can't say it's all great, but the best films, like The Man Who Fell to Earth, or actually even in a weird way, Labyrinth, where he's playing a comedy version of David Bowie, they're wonderful because what you're seeing is the David Bowie you've heard on record, the David Bowie you've seen on stage, transplanted into the film environment. For 10, 15 years, he was always playing a role, So why shouldn't he play a role on screen? And certainly the relationship between the man who fell to earth, you know, the alien figure he plays there, and the people that existed within his records was very, very close, almost indivisibly close. So, you know, the acting side of it is, you know, is a huge part of what makes Bowie what he is.
Wait! I've got a much better plan, Hoggle. Give her this.
The end of the 1980s saw a change in both Bowie's personal and professional life. He decided to reinvent himself as part of the hard rock band Tin Machine, along with guitarist Reeves Gabrels and brothers Tony and Hunt Sales. He was also introduced to supermodel Iman, whom he immediately fell for.
His marriage to Iman seems to have been not just a stabilising thing in his life, but it seems to have given him a degree of perspective and made him sort of, you know, fall in love with the idea of being a bit of a homebody.
The Tin Machine relationship, however, did not last, and Bowie soon returned to life as a solo artist and started experimenting with electronica.
When comes the shaking man, elation in his eyes.
The thing that he kind of refocused on in the 90s was, perversely, the music. It was the thing that got him into it in the first place. It wasn't the presentation. It wasn't the kind of the wigs and the high heels. It was, he got into the idea of reinvestigating what was going on at the moment in terms of, you know, on the fringes of music. You saw, you know, dance producers like Left Field who were thrilled to be asked to work on it.
Stinking weather, fat, shaking hand, dovey morning, dog grumping on.
The great thing about David Bowie is that he is so willing to experiment with different genres of music and different styles. So, you know, one minute he's doing glam rock, the next minute he's doing soul, then he's working with synthesizers, and then he's doing a krautrock thing. And yeah, of course, not all of these things are going to be totally successful, but I think we should applaud him for trying.
It's inevitable when you've got someone who's had such an incredible impact early on that those peaks are very hard to kind of replicate the further you get through your career.
There was a point in the 90s when it looked as if Bowie had just simply run out of ideas. Frankly, I mean, nobody's going to blame him for that. He'd had, you know, a tremendous run of fantastically inventive music. And so he went into ambient, he went into electronica, you know, he associated with Eno, who'd actually, of course, been influenced by him in the first place.
I could never really get into the 90s Bowie. It felt like he's 2 steps behind. Whereas before, it always felt like only Bowie could make these records. Even Scary Monsters, you know, which he had taken inspiration from all these kids that had taken inspiration from him. You know, the New Romantic Movement, the Blitz Club, all of that. But actually, that album doesn't really sound like any of those people. It sounds like Bowie.
6 or 7 of the greatest albums ever. And there's still, you know, there's still much to love about a lot of those records.
Proudly, with any best Bowies, they would have fitted, in terms of quality at least, on any of his great albums. But the problem was that he couldn't sustain it.
Outrageous as it was in the 70s, but it's as strong.
After 2004's A Reality Tour, Bowie stepped out of the limelight, making very few public appearances, with many believing he had fully retired.
I should have tried. I should have been a wiser kind of guy.
The main thing about Bowie in the last decade is that he's rarely seen, apart from he did a live performance, There's and About Mortality.